Let's go to our next political guest. We've got Liberal MP Tim Wilson, who's been standing by patiently as we had a few things to get to. Thanks for sticking by, Tim Wilson. I want to start with what I'm sure plenty of people are talking about in your city of Melbourne. We had that terror attack, of course, not so long ago, another arrest as well. What's the environment like from your take on what people are talking about? Yes, obviously we get a lot more people, for example, killed by motor cars each year, but is there a sense in Melbourne that people are a bit more afraid at the moment or not?
Well, I think Melburnians have always been resilient, and we've seen this terror attack for exactly what it is, somebody who's gone to seek to inflame divisions, cause violence. But what we've also seen is defiance. I mean, as I've spoken, I think, on your program before, we saw a bloke with a supermarket trolley who seems to have a greater command and intent to try and enforce the law than the state government at times. And I think most people are getting through it, but no, there are people who don't want to go into the city, particularly because it was targeted at a great Australian or great Victorian tradition, which is the area around the Bourke Street Mall and Myer Christmas windows, and they're afraid to take their families there.
Interesting development that we've got some Muslim leaders not willing to attend tomorrow's meeting in regards to the terror threat. Scott Morrison said that he wanted as many contributions as you could get from these leaders. We know from the authorities they say they make very important contributions. Now they're offended enough by the PM's comments not to attend. Who do you blame here?
Well, it's not about blame. It's just actually very disappointing. I mean, let's take a parallel example. When we had problems with institutional child sex abuse in religious institutions, we held the institutions and those people who were responsible in setting the tone and the culture of those communities partly responsible for these matters, and certainly as part of the pathway to fix them. And that's what Scott Morrison has done. On this occasion, we've looked to those leaders of the faith that terrorists are seeking to bastardise for their own political ends and saying, you are part of the solution. And, I mean, it's just a statement of the self-bloody obvious. Muslim leaders play a critical role in tackling Islamism, and, you know, we want their participation. They should want to participate for themselves because, of course, I'm sure that they oppose Islamism as well, and the government and the Islamic community should want to work together.
That example, though, of what happened within religious organisations, you had the not-so-small matter of authorities and the institutions basically turning their heads for decades in some cases.
Sure. No, but that's the point. And when a lot of the problems became full into the light of day, then we turned around to those institutions and both looked at their past behaviour and why they may have hit it. But then in terms of restitution, we had to turn around to the people who are currently responsible for those organisations and say, you are part of the solution and part of the redress. And part of the challenge with, you know, Islam is a much more disaggregated faith than, say, for instance, the Catholic Church. But it doesn't change the fact that Islamic leaders are a critical part of combating Islamism and making sure that we have a cohesive, mainstream Islamic community that wants to invest and build this country's future, not to blow it up.
We've got confirmation today the government wants to pull out of the UN Migration Pact. Why do we need to do this?
We need to do this because, well, we don't need to go into it because, firstly, it's a relatively ineffectual proposition. But as you said before, if it turns into a treaty, then we're just going to be faced with the same dilemma. And in the end, the only country, or the only authority that should be responsible for deciding Australia's border policies, migration law, is the Australian government. We are the ones who are in charge. We are the ones who should be making decisions based on our national interests. We should work with other countries, sure. But we are in charge. We should be making decisions about our national interests, and we shouldn't be turning reference from international treaties.
Well, just to that point, Tim Wilson, it does specifically reaffirm the right of states to determine their national migration policy. It's not legally binding and also says states may even distinguish between regular and irregular migration status. So isn't it just about trying to work together rather than taking away any of our own power?
I didn't say there was taking away of our power. I just said that those are the authorities responsible for deciding what our national interest is, and that should be the base of our migration program. And I make no apology about that. When you've got an agreement like this, all it seeks to do is be part of a pathway to undermine that because it has no purpose unless it seeks to in part undermine that. And what we know from those people, from the sort of the radical left, is they use any opportunity of any international agreement to then justify why they should change policies domestically. We're in charge. We make decisions on migration based on Australia's national interest. That is what Australians expect of us, and we should be taking migration that helps build our national interest.
Do you think, on that national interest, that we need to reduce our annual permanent migration cap?
Well, look, we always look at it regularly, but I know it's being discussed as part of, obviously, the budget process next year. And I've said many times it's not just about the volume of migration, it's about what we do with migrants when they come to Australia, because we do have a high concentration of people in Melbourne and Sydney. Why? Because that's where good paying jobs are. We actually need a plan that's going to build the whole of the future of Australia and the opportunity for every Australian to be able to be successful and make sure that
just to that, though,
invest in its future as well as build its future.
As for the plan, Scott Morrison has already given us this figure of 30,000. We don't yet know the plan. Again, do you agree with cutting our permanent migration cap?
Well, these caps move around from time to time, and we also have lower number of people against the current cap we have, a number of people we're actually accepting through. I don't think the sky has fallen in because we have done that. So I'm open to any proposal, but critically, it's not just about the number. It's what you then do with the people who arrive here, because I want people who come to Australia to invest in building this nation's future, to have a happy and successful life, but to contribute to the well-being of the country for every Australian.
Just finally, you're chairing a committee into Labor's franking dividend approach, a change to this, obviously. What's your specific example of someone under this policy, if you want to walk through what they're earning and what shares they have, that it's unfair that they get hit by it?
Well, it's unfair because all people are asking for is their overpaid tax back. You know, when you submit your tax return, Tom, you'll get, if you've overpaid your tax, you get a return on it. Retirees should be no different. And what Labor is coming is turning around and grabbing every bit of overpaid tax for a retiree and putting it in their pocket to spend for their political benefit. I mean, what sort of political party decides that the best thing to do is to push 85-year-olds down the financial staircase? That's what they're doing. That's the fundamental nature of their policy. People who are old, who aren't in a position to change their circumstances, and they're raiding their savings for political benefit. I think it's disgraceful.
I just wanted to go to an example, though, Tim Wilson. I'll give you one that was put forward by one of the lobby groups by the name of Norm Smith. $1 million in super, $700,000 in shares. He'd lose $30,000 a year in his annual income, if you like. He's still worth a fair bit of cash.
Well, no, there's a difference between what people have in assets and obviously what they have in cash and income. And there are people who have much more modest balances than that. There are people who are surviving on incomes that are about $30,000 a year. They can lose up to 30% of their income and can basically put them below the poverty line. I mean, that's a serious matter. Unless you actually accept that people save only to serve the government benefit and the federal budget, and not recognise that people have earned this money and they have a right to, you know, reasonably keep it, you'll support Labor's policy. But if you actually believe that people invest in their future, we should want people to be independent. We should want people to be able to save for their future and then be able to live a sustainable
just about out of time, but just on Norm Smith, who I mentioned, and good luck to the bloke, nothing against him, but he's not really the best example for you to argue against the policy?
Well, I haven't heard about that example, but there are literally, throughout this hearings, hundreds of people who are living on very modest balances and surviving on modest incomes, who will lose up to a third of their income as a consequence of Labor's proposed changes. And in some cases, it will push people below the poverty line. That is not that's not a just policy to govern a country.
Tim Wilson, we're out of time. I'll speak to you again in a fortnight. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Tom.